Hey guys, for the next few minutes, we are going to look at the framing and the structure of the United States Constitution. Now, just like all the other notes on these videos, you're certainly able to stop, to pause it, to fast forward, to go back, rewind. Use this as a review tool. Use this as a way to, if you miss some things in class, that you're able to go back over them. There is also an accompanying fill in the notes study guide and note-taking component. If you go to the blog, it's under the fill-in-the-blank notes. If you want to use that as you go through the slides, do that. This will be a great resource for you. But again, you can go through these at your own pace. So we are going to look at the framing and the structure of the United States Constitution. We're going to analyze the debates during the drafting of the Constitution to include the conversations and decisions made with regards to the Three-Fifths Compromise, the Great Compromise, and the Commerce Clause. We're also going to look and see how the Constitution addressed the weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation, and we're going to get into those here in just a few minutes. We're also going to explain and review the fundamental principles of the United States Constitution. These would include limited government, the rule of law, federalism, the separation of powers, checks and balances, and popular sovereignty. None of these terms or concepts should be foreign to you. At this point, they should be very familiar, and you should understand them well. And so having that understanding will help you get a better understanding of the overall framing and structure of the Constitution. We're also going to look at the key ideas in the debate over the ratification of the Constitution that were made by the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. Just because you draft a Constitution does not mean it goes into effect, just like it did when, just because we declared our independence from England didn't mean that we automatically got it. We had to, action was required on our part, and we had to make things happen. But let's talk about the Articles of Confederation. This was the first constitution of the United States, of our new country following the Revolutionary War. In 1777, the Continental Congress got together and drafted this original Constitution for the Union of the States, and it was known as the Articles of Confederation. Now, in this, the states were very strong, and the federal government was very weak. And if you go back to some of our various forms of government talked about a confederation, this was essentially a confederation, as there were certain powers given to this federal or central government, but the majority of the power remained with the states. And we're going to get with that in minutes. But let's look at the structure of the national government under the Articles of Confederation. There was a Confederation Congress, and then there were committees of congressmen. Now, the Confederation Congress was made up of delegates that were chosen by the state legislatures rather than the voters. Today, we have direct elections of our national representatives to the House of Representatives, as well as our senators. Then the people in the states would elect those that would represent them in the state legislatures, but then the state legislature would choose the delegate to go and represent the state in the National Confederation Congress. Also, each state had only one vote in Congress. In other words, one state, one vote on national issues, regardless of the size of the state, regardless of the population or certain number of people who lived in the state. Each state had only one vote, and this was to even out so that larger states did not overpower smaller states, but it did not give us proportionate representation. And so we're going to talk a little bit more about that in a few minutes. Now, the Confederation Congress was given power to make, implement, and enforce laws, but what we're going to see is there was one significant component that they were not given the power to do that absolutely hindered their ability to implement and enforce laws, and we'll talk about that. But the committees of congressmen, one thing that was not created under the Articles of Confederation was an executive branch or a president. So in other words, now there was no executive function and group to actually enforce the laws that were being drafted by the Confederation Congress. So what they did was they divided those powers of the executive, the powers of the law enforcement side of federal government, among committees. So as you can already see, there are some potential issues facing our country underneath the Articles of Confederation. Now, under those Articles, here's some things that Congress could do. They could raise armies. They could declare war, and they could sign treaties. And so we certainly give that a check mark. However, there were some major barriers to governing a growing nation under the Articles of Confederation. First off, the federal government virtually had no power. In fact, there were often times that the delegates from the states never even showed up to the Confederation Congress to vote on national issues, and there was no federal power there to actually hold them accountable. So again, under the Articles of Confederation, the federal government had no power. Now, the federal Congress could not establish a common currency. So in other words, obviously that would create huge issues in interstate commerce, that commerce and trade between states, because one state would, whatever they would value their currency at, another state could have a different value. Also, without this common currency, our international trade had significant issues facing it, because as other countries would do business with the United States, depending on where they docked or what state they ended up in, would certainly determine the amount their money was worth. And so again, not having a common currency presented a pretty serious issue. Also, we just talked about this, the ability to regulate interstate commerce, to make sure that the business transactions between states were legitimate, to make sure that they were done fairly. And so there was no way for the federal government to regulate this. Also, the federal government couldn't levy taxes. In other words, they could not impose taxes on the colonies or the people. So they had the ability to raise army. They had the ability to declare war. They had the ability to enforce, to make laws and try to enforce them, but they had no way to generate revenue for the national government to actually pay for any of these. So again, significant issue facing the country under the Articles of Confederation. There was no executive branch to enforce laws. And there was also no federal court system. So if there was an issue related to federal legislation, if there was an issue between states, there was no federal court system by which to adjudicate any of the federal legislation that was being passed or any issues between states. Also, as I mentioned before, each state had only one vote regardless of population. It required 2/3 votes were required to pass law, and today a majority is required. Also, this is a glaring piece where the intent by the drafters of the Articles of Confederation made perfect sense, but the unintended consequences were such that they had to be addressed. So the intended result or outcome of this was the fact that you never want to be able to amend a country's rule of law or whatever the Constitution or the rules by which it governs. You don't want to be able to change them easily. Otherwise, they'd be changed all the time, and you'd never be able to have consistency in the governing process. However, the ability to get all of the states to vote unanimously on amendments to the Articles of Confederation was almost impossible. I mean, you can't get a family of 4 to all agree totally on where to go eat, much less imagine all states in the Union to be able to agree on amendments to the Constitution or to the Articles of Confederation. So a unanimous vote was a significant issue. Now, this is not something that are in the standards here, but it's certainly something that we'll review. We talked about this in U.S. history, but we need to circle back because this was really the tipping point, the straw that broke the camel's back. But I think it's important to look back at what was going on in Massachusetts and what was going on from an economic standpoint in the colonies that really brought the weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation to light. Now, a real quick review of what was going on. We had just finished war, a number of years before we had finished war with England, and certainly at that point, England before they were our biggest customer, and so if you go to war with your biggest customer, you're going to have an issue with your economy. And so there was a slowdown in trade, not only domestically here in the United States, but also internationally. And so this slowdown in trade increased unemployment here at home. with increased unemployment means more people were out of work. Also, because of the slowdown in trade, there were reduced prices paid to farmers. If you remember, agriculture and many of the natural resources that we had here, those were huge exports to other countries. And so with a slowdown in trade, now not as much was being traded back and forth. A reduced amount of money paid to farmers created a pretty significant economic issue for farmers. Now, while that is serious, it would not be as big an issue except for the fact that most Americans were farmers. And so with most Americans being farmers, most of the farmers were in debt. And when they're in debt, they do not have the ability to pay for their farms, their equipment, to pay back the loans, or even to pay the taxes on their property. So Western Massachusetts, 1786, farmers tried to shut down the courts to stop foreclosure hearings. Because they were in debt, they were unable to pay the taxes on their farms. Many of them were unable to pay the notes on their farms. And so what was happening? That the courts were then foreclosing and taking over their lands and their farms, and this was reaching a point of desperation for the farmers. Now the farmers in Western Massachusetts were led by a gentleman named Daniel Shays. If you didn't remember before, now this is probably starting you're starting to recognize some of the things that were going on there. And again, the issue that the farmers could not pay the high Massachusetts taxes. 1787, Shays led 1,000 farmers to seize weapons from an armory and again attempted to shut down the courts, this time via armed insurrection. Now, we all know that this was known as Shays' Rebellion, and it brought a significant issue to the forefront as it relates to federal power under the Articles of Confederation, because the governments and the towns and the courts in Western Massachusetts were screaming to the federal government, "Hey, we need some help here. We've got 1,000 farmers that are now converging on us. They're armed. We need you to call in the military. We need your help." And then General Washington, who was still in charge of the Continental Army, he responded back, said, as much as I would like to, one, the federal government does not have a power to call in a militia, and two, the militia and the members of the Continental Army that fought the British, well, many of them, and in fact those that I would call out that would be in the militia, are those that are actually trying to stop the foreclosure hearings there in Western Massachusetts. And so those Minutemen and the people who made up the Continental Army, many of them were the ones who were actually a part of the rebellion. And so this really showed a glaring issue underneath the Articles of Confederation, and really screamed that something had to change. So now, as we draft this new Constitution, this is where we're going to start to see how our government that we reside under today was actually formed. Now, one thing I want you to consider is that when you think about how governments usually are formed, they're formed one of two ways before this. Either by chance, in other words, this group of people lived in close proximity to another group and they had to learn really how to coexist and how to work together, and so they formed like these rules, and this is how we're going to work together if we're going to live this close together. So one, by chance, and two, by war, that if somebody didn't like the way a government was running a country or whatever, then they would overtake them. And so that's the way that governments are formed, one of two ways. Well, this big experiment that was the United States it really was brought about a third way by which to create a country and to create a government, and that is purposefully, intentionally sit down in a room, and delegates and scholars and statesmen would sit down and literally create a government. And so that's what we've got here. In May 1787, 12 of 13 states sent delegates to the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Does anybody have any idea which state did not send a delegate? If you guessed Rhode Island, you are absolutely right. Rhode Island did not send a delegate to the Constitutional Convention because they were pretty afraid of what may happen if this convention was successful in creating this new Constitution, in creating this new strong government, because they had a pretty huge independent liberty streak across their back. They were afraid that this new government might hinder or might restrict their freedoms, their civil liberties, their state power, their state rights. And so they were a little concerned, and so they did not send a representative to the Constitutional Convention. Now, the mission of this convention was to make amendments to the Articles of Confederation, and they met in Independence Hall. As a matter of fact, you can go to Independence Hall today. Right there in distance to touch is the Liberty Bell, and it's a great place to go if you get a chance to. Now, the delegates all met behind closed doors and windows. Now, you can imagine May, Philadelphia. It was hot, and in 1787 there was no air conditioning, so you can imagine how uncomfortable it was. And so I'm sure your first question is saying, well, why in the world did they not open windows and doors and allow drafts to come through? Well, they wanted to keep their meetings secret from the public and closed. And so, matter of fact, guards guarded the doors and the windows because they wanted the delegates to be able to speak freely, to be able to talk through issues without public opinion, because everybody's got opinion. So the Constitutional or Continental Convention, this is at 1787. You can see this picture is a very familiar picture, and you can see the gentleman who is there, very familiar, encased in the circle. Yeah, that's George Washington. Now, despite his reluctance, George Washington presided over the convention. I mean, they asked him, and he really didn't want to at first. But when you really think about it, this is a room full of politicians and statesmen and everything else. There was really only one person in the country that could stand before this group and command respect. And General Washington certainly was that person, and he presided over it. And also, one part of his reluctance was the fact that he wasn't sure how this thing was going to turn out. I mean, this was probably the greatest political experiment ever attempted, and for him to preside over that certainly could damage a lot of things that he had worked for. But again, President Washington, almost President Washington, would certainly do an unbelievable job in presiding over. Now, there were many key people and leaders as a part of this Continental Convention and the creation of the Constitution. But one of the key players was James Madison. He is known as the father of the Constitution. Now, some of the things that he favored a republic rather than the British system. He believed that the voters should have all of the power and give that power to the government as opposed to Parliament or government having more of the power. He wanted a government that was strong, however, because he was a Federalist. He also wanted the well-educated to govern. I mean, he wanted the people who were making decisions for our country. He wanted them to be well-educated. That's a legitimate desire. And so, James Madison was important during the creation as well as the adoption of the Constitution. Now, these delegates to the Continental Convention, in looking at drafting this new Constitution, had a number of significant questions to answer. Now, one of them was a legislative question to answer, and it was, how should Congress be designed? So this was, we had a couple of different things. We had many people with their own ideas. And so as they were sitting down, two plans emerged as the primary plans to look at how to form this congressional component of the United States government. So there was the Virginia plan and the New Jersey plan. Now, the Virginia plan called for a big national government or a strong national government. It was proposed by James Madison from Virginia. It included 3 branches of government. It also included a bicameral or a 2-house legislature that was filled, and the representation was based on the state population. The Virginia plan also called for a strong president. Now, the other side was the New Jersey plan. It called for a small or very limited national government. It was proposed by William Patterson from New Jersey. It also proposed 3 branches of government. However, it proposed a unicameral legislature. And again, going back to this one state, one vote on national issues, regardless of the size or regardless of the number of people that lived in the state. The New Jersey plan also called for an executive committee and no president. So the solution that they came up with is what we know as the Great Compromise. The Great Compromise created a bicameral or a two-house legislature. So this is what the legislative branch looked like then and what we have today. So we have a House of Representatives where the representatives, the number of representatives from the states are determined by the population of that state, and we have 2 senators from every state go to the United States Senate. And so that's that bicameral legislature. One of them, the representation is based on a state's population. The other, every state has 2 senators going to the Senate. Now, on top of the legislative questions to answer, they also had a pretty major executive question to answer as well. Do we trust the people to elect the president or not? Now, the solution was the Electoral College. Now, under the Electoral College, the popular vote, whoever wins the popular vote, sends the electors to vote at the Electoral College. In other words, whoever wins the popular vote in a state will receive the electoral votes from that state. Now, each state has a different ways that they award the electoral votes. Sometimes it's the winner take all. Sometimes it's proportional, where depending on what proportion of the vote that a candidate receives gets those number of electoral votes. But nevertheless, it all goes back to who wins the popular vote gets those electors. Now, the number of electors from each state includes the number of representatives in the House of Representatives plus the 2 senators. That equals the number of electors from a state. Now, a very, very important concept to understand is that the electors from the state are not our elected officials. They are chosen by the state conventions and the party conventions in each state. So our elected officials are not electors from the state. And we'll talk more about that when we get into looking at elections and things. So here is a map, a recent map, 2016, of the electors and the number of electors from each state. Around the country, in total, there are 538 electors available in the Electoral College. Now, for a presidential candidate to win the presidency, that candidate needs to receive and win 270 of the electoral votes. That's a majority. And we'll talk more when we get to the unit talking about elections. Now, there was a representation question to answer in addition to when talking about the legislative component. Now there's another representation question that they had to answer. With regards to representation in Congress, should slaves be counted as part of the population? Now, what I want to do is I've got another couple of questions that I want to pose to you. And when I do, I want you to stop the video and I want you to think about the impact of this, and think about the impact of this question that the Continental delegates had to answer. And then I want you to think about these 2 questions. If slaves were counted as a part of the population, what would be the implications as it relates to representation in Congress? And why would this representation question be important? I mean, why should this even be an issue? So think about the implications about having the slave population. Think about all the aspects of the slave population. And then why would this representation question be important? So stop, and I want you to think about it, and then we'll continue on. Great to have you back. Now, the solution to the question of whether slaves should be counted as a part of the population with regards to representation was what we know as the 3/5 compromise. The 3/5 compromise is where they decided to count each slave as 3/5 of a person when determining the delegates for the House of Representatives and the Electoral College. So this is the 3/5 compromise, and this all had to deal with representation in Congress. Now we're going to look at some of the fundamental principles of the United States Constitution, including limited government, the rule of law, federalism, separation of powers, checks and balances, and popular sovereignty. Again, these should be very familiar to you as we go through. Of course, limited government is where the central government does not have too much power, and the only powers that it has are those given by the people through laws. Those laws would be found in the United States Constitution. And the rule of law is the Constitution and this principle of government by law, where all people and institutions, to include the government and all those in it, are subject and accountable to the law, and that law is fairly applied and enforced. Certainly, federalism is something that we have been talking about. It's that method of distributing power between a national government and state governments. It's that shared power. And so that is certainly the federalism, and we've talked a lot about that. Now, popular sovereignty. Popular sovereignty is the concept to where people are sovereign and they have all of the political power, that the government only governs with the consent of the people. And again, this is something that looking at, there are many ways to talk about this, where the citizens are the ones in power in a government. But popular sovereignty is where, the people, the populace, are the ones that are sovereign. So let's look at the three branches of government. As we've already talked about this, the philosophy of Montesquieu and the three branches of government and the separation of powers. It comes to light right here as we're drafting this new Constitution. It's certainly something that we reside under today. We had the legislative branch, and that includes Congress and the House of Representatives and the Senate. We had the executive branch, which includes the president, the vice president, and his cabinet, his cabinet are his secretaries, the Secretary of Defense, the Secretary of Agriculture, the Secretary of the Treasury, the Secretary of State, all those. And then you have the judicial branch. That includes the Supreme Court and the federal courts underneath it. So this separation of powers, the only way that this thing works, and the only way to keep one branch of the government from becoming too powerful, is this system of checks and balances that we're now going to look at. And this system of checks and balances still exists today. So we've got the three branches of government: the executive branch, the legislative branch, and the judicial branch. The executive branch is made up of the president and the cabinet. The legislative branch is made up of Congress, that's the House of Representatives, and the Senate. And then the judicial branch is made up of the Supreme Court and the federal courts. Now, the powers of the executive branch are to enforce the laws. The powers of the executive branch is to write the laws, and the power of the judicial branch is to interpret laws. And so you can see each branch of the government has a distinct set of responsibilities. Now let's look at the check that each branch has over the other. And let's start with the executive branch. So the executive branch can nominate and appoint judges to the Supreme Court. Now this part is where the president can nominate, but there is a confirmation piece that we're going to look at here in just a second. The president can also veto acts of Congress. In other words, if Congress creates a law and it makes it to the president's desk and he doesn't like it, doesn't want it to become law, he can veto it. So now let's look at the legislative branch and its checks and balances, checks over the executive and the judicial. The legislative branch can override a presidential veto. So if the president vetoes it, the legislative branch can override that. They can also remove the president from office. Does anybody know what that is called? Yeah, that's impeachment. And so now over the judicial branch, the legislative branch can refuse to appoint the judges. And this is over the judicial branch as well as the executive branch. Because here's what happens and here's how it goes about. The president nominates Supreme Court justices. These justices then go before what we know as confirmation hearings in front of Congress. And so that's where they ask questions, and that's kind of that vetting process, and that's that admission process. And if they make it through and they get the thumbs up, then they become Supreme Court justices. So that's how that plays out. Now, the judicial branch, its power over the legislative and the executive branch is the fact that it can declare acts or laws unconstitutional. That's when the Supreme Court will sit down and look at how some of these laws are put into place, as well as the laws that are being drafted, and they can determine whether or not those are constitutional. Excuse me. So let's look at some of the powers and some of the framework of the Constitution as it relates, and you'll see how this differs from the Articles of Confederation. The powers of the national government versus state government. this is the concept of federalism, where the power is divided between the state and federal governments. Now, the states, how they're represented in Congress. You had Senate, you had 2 from every state, and then you had members of the House of Representatives, where the number of those representatives were based on a state's population. If you remember back to the Articles of Confederation, 1 state, 1 vote. That was it. Executive power. Under this Constitution, a powerful president would be created in the executive branch, and this president would carry out the laws. Now, the vote required to make laws. This would be a majority in the House and Senate, then signed by the President. If you remember back, it was 2/3 majority on the Articles of Confederation. Now, the vote required to change or amend the Constitution. You see a distinct difference here. As opposed to having where all the states had to give unanimous consent to an amendment, underneath this Constitution, this amendment would be approved by 3/4 or 75% of state legislatures, or by a special state convention in 3/4 of the states. And so again, the purpose is to make it very, very, very difficult to amend the Constitution, but to make it possible. Tax power. Under the Constitution, the federal government can raise money by taxing, unlike the Articles of Confederation where it couldn't. Military powers. Congress could approve treaties and declare war. The president became the commander-in-chief of the military and armed forces, and also could negotiate treaties. And so underneath the Constitution, the commander-in-chief or the president cannot declare war without the approval of Congress. Currency powers. That the federal government can create a common national currency. That means that $5 bill that you might have in your pocket is good in any state in the United States. And so, it enabled the states to do business, and it enabled citizens to do business across states and across the country. Commerce powers. The Constitution gave the commerce powers, or the ability to regulate trade, to Congress. Now, this is known as the Commerce Clause, and you can find this in Article 1, Section 8. In Article 1, it talks about the powers of the legislature, of the congressional powers. And the Commerce Clause, what it did was it established that Congress had the power to regulate foreign and interstate commerce. And so this is not only trade with other countries, but also the interstate, or the trade between the states. Now, a court system was created by the Constitution. This was a federal court system known as the judicial branch, include again the Supreme Court and the various federal. But just because we draft a new Constitution does not mean that it's going to immediately become and go into effect. There was a ratifying that had to happen. Ratifying was what had to be the acceptance from the states, and there was a significant struggle over the ratification of the Constitution. As you can imagine, we just finished a war with England to break away from a very strong and overbearing central government, and so you can imagine, the fear and the reluctance from states and people in the states to draft this new Constitution to create a strong federal government. I mean, all they had visions of were England. Now, required to approve or to ratify the Constitution, 9 of 13 states had to give the thumbs up. Now, during the struggle and during the debates and the conversations and the backs and forth over the ratification, 2 groups emerged. These were the Federalists. These were those who supported the Constitution, and the Anti-Federalists. These were those who opposed the Constitution. So again, we look at the Federalists versus the Anti-Federalists. Anti-Federalists are against ratification. The Federalists favors ratification. So let's look at some of the key players in each one. So you're going to recognize these names. This is a who's who list of our founding fathers. On the Anti-Federalist side, those that are against the Constitution, you had Thomas Jefferson. You had Samuel Adams. Of course, you'd have Sam Adams, who started and founded the Sons of Liberty, also the Committees of Correspondence. I mean, he was one of the major proponents for revolution to break away from England. You had John Hancock. You certainly see his name. His is the biggest signature on the Declaration of Independence. He wanted to make sure that the Parliament and the King saw his name, so he was not going to be in favor of a strong federal government in this Constitution. You had Patrick Henry, who said, "Give me liberty or give me death." He's not going to dive right in and join in on building a new Constitution and a strong federal government. But on the Federalist side, you had George Washington, you had Benjamin Franklin, James Madison that we already talked about, Alexander Hamilton, and John Jay. And so, again, this is a very, very strong group, both sides, on both sides of the argument, but both sides of this discussion about whether we ratify the Constitution or not. Now, so during the discussions, the Anti-Federalists had concerns, and then the Federalists responded to these concerns. I mean, as you go through and start to see how, and primarily how the weakness of the Articles of Confederation and the concerns of the Anti-Federalists were addressed by the Federalists. One of them was that the Constitution gave a national government too much power. Now, the Federalists responded by saying that no, the Constitution gave enough power to solve the country's problems. I mean, you think back on the Articles of Confederation. I mean, there were many issues facing the country. One was revenue. I mean, they just got through the war. They couldn't even raise taxes to pay back the war debts for the Revolutionary War. And so there were issues facing the country that under the Articles of Confederation just wasn't going to happen. And so the Federalists said, no, there was enough power to solve the country's problems under this new Constitution. So one other concern, the Anti-Federalists said this president would be just like a king. The response was that, no, this system of checks and balances will limit the president's power as well as the other branches. The biggest concern, and one of the biggest concerns to the Anti-Federalists, was the fact that individual liberties of the people as well as the states would be threatened by a powerful federal government. And the response to the Federalists, and this was really the one key piece that pushed the ratification through, was the fact that the Federalists said that they would add a Bill of Rights to the Constitution that will protect citizens' freedoms and the powers of the state. If you recall, those are the first 10 amendments to the Constitution, and we'll talk about those in upcoming notes and classes. Also, that the federal government could come under control of one powerful group. Now, the Federalists responded with this, saying that, listen, the country is just too big to be dominated by one group. Now, even today that there are individuals and there are small groups that have some pretty significant pull and influence within our federal government, the country is still too big to be dominated by one. But as we all know, the Federalists won. Here are some of the reasons why. If you guys remember the Federalist Papers, this was a series of 85 essays written by Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay under the pen name of Publius, as in looking to address and proponents of the ratification, do it anonymously. But the Federalist Papers, known as the Federalist, was incredibly influential. It was primarily meant for the citizens of New York, as they were one of the first to vote on the ratification, and it had huge impact there in New York. And it was really the New York Times bestseller when it was written and went out, if there was a New York Times bestseller back then. But again, the Federalist Papers had a huge impact on the ratification of the Constitution. Also, the fact that the Federalists focused on the flaws of the Articles of Confederation. I mean, if you got something that's not working and you present some solutions, it's going to bring some weight. Also, they had a well-organized group. I mean, you got a national push for any kind of national initiative. You got to have a well-organized machine getting the message out, and they certainly had one. Now, here's something that could not be underscored or underplayed and had significant influence. The Federalists had George Washington and Ben Franklin. I mean, these two guys, when these guys talked, people listened. And because of who they were, because of their accomplishments, because of their stature within the country, and the fact that they were really, while no one is absolutely perfect, they were above reproach when it looked at the eyes of people in the United States. And the fact that George Washington and Ben Franklin was in favor of this Constitution brought and gave a lot of weight and a lot of credibility to the Constitution. And the fact that the Federalists agreed to add a Bill of Rights to the Constitution was that cherry on top of this constitutional sundae that they were making, and that's really what pushed everything over. All right, well, that wraps up our discussions of the framing and the structure of the United States Constitution. I hope this has provided some insight. Again, if there are some pieces that you missed, go back. You can stop the video at any time. You can pause it. Again, you can review it as much as you like, but I encourage you, to take the accompanying notes with it if you'd like to go through this. But please use this not only as a review component and a resource for the upcoming test, but also when you need to review some of the framing issues around the Constitution and some of the basic fundamental components of our government, especially in the transition to this new Constitution. I hope you use it a lot. Hey, if you got any questions, certainly email me or stop by the classroom. Otherwise, I look forward to seeing you on campus.